Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Lab. Tonight's title uses the word mutant a little playfully, and it's worth being clear about that from the very start, because the science behind it is genuinely fascinating rather than anything to worry about. If you've ever felt a quiet sense of guilt or failure about being wide awake and clear-headed at midnight while the rest of the world seems to have effortlessly drifted off hours earlier, tonight's episode is for you, because a considerable body of careful genetic research now shows that your particular rhythm may not be a habit, a weakness, or a poor choice at all, but something written directly into your DNA, a genuine, heritable variation passed down the same way eye color or height gets passed down, simply expressing itself through the precise timing of your body's internal clock instead. Tonight we're going to walk slowly through 13 genuine, evidence-based facts about the biology of being a night owl, the specific genes involved, what researchers have discovered about why this variation exists at all, and what the accumulated science suggests about living well within whichever chronotype your own body happens to carry. None of this requires guilt, and none of it requires becoming someone you're not. It's worth pausing for a moment on why this particular topic tends to carry such a personal, sometimes emotionally loaded weight for so many people, in a way that other areas of sleep science sometimes don't quite reach in the same way. Chronotype isn't simply an abstract scientific curiosity most people encounter only in passing. It's something nearly everyone has already, quietly lived through some version of, whether that meant genuine struggle through years of early school mornings that never once felt natural, or a persistent, low-grade sense of guilt about staying productively alert long after most of the household has gone to sleep, or simply a lifetime of well-meaning advice from others insisting that early rising represents the single correct, virtuous way to structure a day. Tonight's exploration isn't really designed to overturn every piece of that lived experience. It's designed to offer something more like a second, more accurate explanation for it, replacing the old, quietly critical story with a genuinely evidence-based one, written not in judgment, but in the actual language of your own DNA. If this kind of journey is worth your time, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps this small lab keep its lights on for other sleepy minds finding their way here. But for now, there is nothing you need to do except settle in, let your body grow heavy, and let your own particular rhythm carry you gently toward rest, whenever it happens to arrive tonight. Let's begin. Long before scientists could point to any specific gene responsible for the timing of sleep and wakefulness, researchers had already established, through careful twin and family studies, that chronotype, the general term for a person's natural tendency toward earlier or later sleep timing, carried a genuinely significant hereditary component, with identical twins showing considerably more similar sleep timing patterns than fraternal twins, even when both sets of twins were raised within the very same household and environment. The actual molecular machinery behind this hereditary pattern began coming into focus starting in the 1990s and accelerating considerably through the following decades, as researchers identified a specific set of genes, now collectively called clock genes, that work together within nearly every cell of the body to generate a self-sustaining, approximately 24-hour biological rhythm, a discovery significant enough that the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded jointly to Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young specifically for their foundational work uncovering the precise molecular mechanism behind this internal clock, initially studied in fruit flies before researchers confirmed remarkably similar clock genes operate within human cells as well. These genes function through an elegant, self-regulating feedback loop, in which certain genes produce proteins that gradually accumulate throughout the day, eventually reaching a concentration high enough to suppress the very genes responsible for producing them, causing protein levels to gradually decline again, a cycle that repeats reliably every 24 hours and effectively functions as the cellular equivalent of a ticking clock, present not just within specialized brain cells but within nearly every tissue throughout the entire body. Understanding that chronotype traces back to this genuinely physical, well-characterized molecular mechanism, rather than simply reflecting personal discipline or lifestyle choice, represents the essential foundation for everything else we'll explore throughout tonight's episode, since it reframes the entire conversation around sleep timing away from questions of willpower and toward questions of genuine, inherited biology. Researchers studying these clock genes have found something genuinely remarkable about just how deeply, anciently conserved this molecular timing mechanism actually is across the entire history of life on Earth, with recognizably similar clock gene systems found operating not only in humans and fruit flies, but across an enormous range of other organisms, including plants, fungi, and even certain bacteria. suggesting the fundamental biological need to track and anticipate the roughly 24-hour cycle of light and darkness produced by Earth's own rotation represents one of evolution's oldest, most persistently useful innovations, present in some recognizable form long before anything resembling a human brain, or indeed a human, ever existed at all. This deep evolutionary history helps explain why clock genes function with such remarkable, well-preserved consistency across such a wide range of otherwise very different organisms, and why studying something as seemingly distant as fruit fly genetics ultimately proved so directly, usefully applicable to understanding the specific genetic variations responsible for human chronotype differences discussed throughout the remainder of tonight's episode. Among the various clock genes researchers have studied in connection with individual chronotype differences, a gene called PR3, short for period 3, has emerged as one of the most consistently, directly linked to whether a person naturally tends toward earlier or later sleep timing. Researchers studying PR3 have identified a specific genetic variation involving the length of a particular repeated sequence within the gene, with individuals carrying a longer version of this repeated sequence showing a measurably stronger tendency toward morning-type chronotype, earlier natural sleep and wake timing, greater subjective sleepiness following sleep deprivation, and a somewhat increased vulnerability to the negative effects of insufficient sleep, compared to individuals carrying the shorter version of the same repeated sequence, who tend to show a correspondingly stronger evening-type tendency and, in several studies, somewhat greater resilience when facing sleep loss. This specific genetic variation has become one of the most frequently studied, most directly replicated findings within the broader field of chronotype genetics, with researchers using it as a genuinely useful biological marker for identifying and studying the underlying differences between morning-type and evening-type individuals in considerably more controlled, precise detail than relying on self-reported sleep preference questionnaires alone could ever achieve. Beyond simply predicting sleep timing preference, researchers studying PR3 have found genuinely interesting connections to cognitive performance patterns as well, discovering that the specific time of day at which a person performs best on various cognitive tasks correlates measurably with their particular PR3 genetic variant, offering direct, biological confirmation for something many people have long suspected about themselves without any formal genetic evidence, that their own personal window of peak mental sharpness follows a genuinely individual, biologically rooted schedule rather than conforming neatly to the conventional 9-to-5 timing much of modern society still tends to assume applies equally well to everyone. Researchers studying PR3's specific role have also found genuinely interesting connections to how different chronotypes respond to caffeine and other common alertness supporting strategies, with some studies finding that individuals carrying the shorter, evening-leaning PR3 variant show measurably different sensitivity to caffeine's alerting effects compared to carriers of the longer, morning-leaning variant, suggesting even something as seemingly universal and straightforward as how a person response to their morning coffee may itself trace back, at least partially, to the same underlying genetic variation responsible for their broader chronotype. This growing body of research has encouraged some sleep researchers to speculate, cautiously, about a future in which genuinely personalized sleep and alertness guidance, informed directly by an individual's specific clock gene variants, might eventually become a genuinely practical, routine part of how people approach scheduling their own daily lives, though researchers are careful to note this kind of fully personalized, genetically informed guidance remains, for now, still considerably more aspiration than current, widely available clinical practice. Beyond PR3 specifically, researchers studying human chronotype have identified variations across numerous other genes within the broader clock gene family, including CRY1, a gene whose protein product plays a central, well-established role within the same core molecular feedback loop discussed in tonight's first fact. A particularly striking discovery published in 2017 found that a specific mutation within the CRY1 gene, present in a meaningful proportion of certain studied populations, produces a measurably lengthened internal circadian rhythm, causing carriers to naturally, consistently feel most alert and prefer falling asleep considerably later than individuals without this particular mutation, a pattern researchers found so consistent and so strongly tied to genuinely delayed sleep timing that they classified it as a specific, identifiable genetic cause of what sleep medicine formally recognizes as delayed sleep phase disorder, a condition in which a person's natural sleep timing runs persistently, significantly later than conventional social and work schedules generally accommodate. What makes this particular discovery genuinely significant, beyond simply adding one more gene to the growing list connected to chronotype, is how directly, mechanically researchers were able to trace the mutation's specific effect on the underlying molecular clock, finding that the mutated Cry1 protein remains active within cells for a measurably longer duration than the typical, unmutated version, effectively stretching out each cycle of the core 24-hour feedback loop discussed earlier tonight, which in turn shifts the entire body's natural sleep-wake timing later to match this genuinely lengthened internal cycle. This research offers a genuinely clear, mechanistically satisfying example of precisely how a single genetic variation can produce a measurable, whole-body behavioral consequence, tracing an unbroken chain of causation from one specific altered protein, through its effect on a cellular feedback loop, all the way to a person's own subjective, lifelong experience of naturally, reliably staying up later than most people around them. This same 2017 research team, alongside other laboratories studying similarly rare, strongly effective clock gene mutations, has also identified variants producing the opposite pattern entirely: extreme morning type chronotype, sometimes called familial advanced sleep phase syndrome, in which affected individuals naturally, reliably fall asleep in the early evening and wake extremely early the following morning, often hours ahead of typical sleep timing, a pattern traced to different specific mutations affecting other genes within the same core molecular clock system. Studying both of these opposite extremes together has proven genuinely valuable for researchers, since comparing precisely how different mutations affecting different specific points within the same underlying molecular feedback loop each produce their own distinct, predictable shift in sleep timing has allowed scientists to map the entire clock mechanism with considerably greater precision than studying either extreme in isolation ever could, essentially using nature's own rare genetic variations as a series of carefully placed experimental probes into exactly how the whole intricate system actually works. Sleep researchers studying chronotype differences have found that morning type and evening type individuals don't merely differ in when they happen to prefer sleeping, but show measurably different underlying circadian rhythm timing across numerous separate physiological markers, offering compelling, converging evidence that these differences reflect a genuinely distinct internal clock setting rather than simply a difference in habit or discipline. Researchers measuring the overnight release timing of melatonin, the hormone that helps signal the body's transition toward sleep, have found that evening-type individuals show a measurably later melatonin onset compared to morning-type individuals, often by 2 hours or more, meaning an evening-type person's body genuinely isn't yet biologically prepared for sleep at a time when a morning-type person's body already is, entirely independent of either person's conscious intention or effort regarding when they'd prefer to fall asleep. Similarly, researchers measuring core body temperature rhythm, discussed in an earlier Sleep Lab episode covering the body's overnight processes, have found that evening-type individuals show a correspondingly delayed temperature minimum, the specific point during the night when body temperature reaches its lowest point, typically occurring considerably later for evening types compared to morning types, a difference reflecting genuine, measurable variation in the timing of the body's broader circadian rhythm rather than any difference in willpower or personal choice. This body of research carries a genuinely important practical implication worth sitting with directly, that asking a genuine evening-type person to simply try harder to fall asleep earlier, without addressing this underlying, measurably different internal timing, resembles asking someone to simply try harder to see clearly without their glasses, treating a genuine physiological difference as though it were instead a matter of insufficient effort or commitment. Researchers studying these physiological markers have also found that evening-type individuals, when actually permitted to sleep according to their own natural, unforced timing, generally do not show the kind of cognitive impairment or health deficits associated with genuine sleep deprivation, since their sleep quality and duration prove entirely comparable to morning types once each group is allowed to align with their own underlying biological schedule. This distinction matters enormously for correctly interpreting much of the earlier public health research connecting evening-type chronotype to various negative health outcomes, since more recent, carefully controlled studies have found that much of this earlier association likely traced back specifically to the chronic mismatch between evening type's natural timing and conventional social scheduling demands, rather than reflecting anything inherently, biologically problematic about evening type chronotype itself, a genuinely important scientific refinement that shifts the practical, evidence-based recommendation away from trying to change a person's underlying chronotype and toward instead reducing the harmful mismatch between that chronotype and the schedule they're actually required to follow. While chronotype carries a genuinely significant genetic component, researchers studying how sleep timing preference changes across a person's life have found a remarkably consistent, well-documented developmental pattern layered on top of that underlying genetic foundation. Young children tend to show a strong morning-type tendency, naturally waking early and growing sleepy relatively early in the evening, a pattern that gradually shifts as children enter adolescence, with research consistently finding that the teenage years bring a genuinely significant, biologically driven shift toward later chronotype, with melatonin release timing measurably delaying by roughly 2 hours on average during adolescence compared to earlier childhood, meaning a teenager's natural biological inclination toward later sleep and wake timing reflects genuine, hormonally driven developmental change rather than simple teenage laziness or defiance, a finding that has directly informed ongoing public health advocacy in several countries pushing for later school start times specifically to better accommodate this well-documented, biologically genuine adolescent sleep shift. This evening-leaning chronotype tendency typically reaches its latest point somewhere around the late teens or early 20s, after which researchers have found chronotype gradually, steadily shifts back toward morning-type timing across the remainder of adulthood, with most people experiencing a slow, continuous trend toward earlier natural sleep and wake timing as they move through their 30s, 40s, and beyond, eventually often becoming genuinely morning-type again by their later years, a pattern researchers connect to gradual, well-documented age-related changes within the same underlying circadian rhythm system discussed throughout tonight's episode. This lifespan pattern offers an important, genuinely reassuring piece of context for anyone currently experiencing a strong evening-type tendency, particularly younger adults, since research suggests this particular phase of chronotype, while genuinely, biologically real and deserving of respect rather than dismissal, is also, for most people, one specific chapter within a longer, naturally evolving lifetime pattern rather than a permanently fixed characteristic destined to remain entirely unchanged forever. Researchers studying this predictable lifespan pattern have also examined whether biological sex plays any measurable role in its specific timing, finding genuinely interesting evidence that women, on average, tend to reach their own peak evening-type shift somewhat earlier than men do, and correspondingly begin the gradual shift back toward morning-type timing at a somewhat younger age as well, a pattern researchers have connected to broader differences in reproductive hormone timing between the sexes, though the underlying biological mechanism connecting these two systems remains an active, still developing area of research. This sex-based difference adds a genuinely interesting additional layer of nuance to the broader lifespan pattern, suggesting that even the specific timing of chronotype's well-documented developmental arc isn't entirely uniform across every individual, but continues to reflect the same kind of genuine, biologically rooted variation running throughout nearly every other fact explored across tonight's episode. Given how strongly modern society tends to favor and accommodate morning-type scheduling, researchers studying the evolutionary origins of chronotype diversity have puzzled over a genuinely interesting question: why natural selection would have preserved such a wide, genuinely persistent range of sleep timing preferences across the human population rather than simply favoring a single, uniform chronotype universally. One particularly compelling proposed explanation, sometimes called the sentinel hypothesis, points toward a genuine evolutionary advantage that chronotype diversity may have offered to early human communities living in small, close-knit groups exposed to genuine, ongoing predation and safety risks throughout the night. Researchers studying this hypothesis have proposed that a community containing a genuine mixture of early sleeping, early waking morning types and late sleeping, late waking evening types would, purely as a natural byproduct of this chronotype diversity, experience considerably less total time during which every single member of the group was simultaneously, vulnerably asleep at once, since the evening types would naturally remain awake and alert later into the night, while the morning types would naturally wake earlier the following day, together providing a genuinely continuous, naturally emerging pattern of overnight vigilance without requiring any deliberate, effortful organization or formally assigned watch schedule at all. A frequently cited 2017 study examining sleep timing among the Hadza, a modern hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania whose lifestyle offers researchers a genuinely valuable window into sleep patterns resembling those of ancient human ancestors, found that across a monitored period spanning multiple consecutive nights, moments during which every single member of the studied group was simultaneously asleep at the very same time proved genuinely rare, occurring for only a small fraction of the total nighttime hours observed, offering compelling, real-world supporting evidence for exactly the kind of naturally emerging, staggered overnight vigilance the sentinel hypothesis predicts chronotype diversity should reliably produce. Beyond the sentinel hypothesis specifically, Some researchers have proposed complementary evolutionary explanations that don't necessarily compete with this vigilance-based theory but may operate alongside it, including the possibility that chronotype diversity historically supported a more efficient overall division of daily labor within small ancestral communities, with genuinely earlier risers naturally taking on tasks best suited to the early morning hours, while genuinely later risers naturally handled different responsibilities better suited to the later day and evening, allowing a community's total available daylight and darkness hours to be covered more thoroughly and efficiently than a uniformly single chronotype population could ever achieve on its own. Whether the true evolutionary explanation ultimately rests more heavily on vigilance, labor division, or some combination of both alongside other factors researchers haven't yet fully identified, the underlying pattern remains consistent across every proposed explanation, that chronotype diversity likely persisted throughout human evolutionary history precisely because it offered some genuine, measurable advantage to the group as a whole, rather than representing some kind of random, functionally meaningless variation that simply happened to survive without serving any particular evolutionary purpose at all. Before researchers could study chronotype's genetic and biological underpinnings with any real scientific rigor, they first needed a reliable, standardized way to actually measure and classify individual chronotype in the first place, a challenge addressed in 1976 by researchers James Horn and Olive Ostberg, who developed what became known as the Morningness-Eveningness questionnaire, a carefully validated set of questions asking respondents about their natural preferences and typical performance patterns across various times of day, ultimately producing a numerical score placing each respondent somewhere along a continuous spectrum ranging from definite morning type through intermediate type to definite evening type. This questionnaire, along with subsequent refinements developed by other researchers in the decades since, including the widely used Munich chronotype questionnaire, which specifically asks respondents to report their actual sleep timing on both workdays and free days to help account for the genuine, well-documented gap between a person's biologically preferred sleep timing and the timing their work or school schedule actually requires, provided the essential, standardized measurement tool. That made rigorous, comparable scientific research into chronotype's genetic and physiological underpinnings genuinely possible in the first place. Researchers using these validated measurement tools have consistently found that chronotype, when measured across large populations, distributes along a genuinely continuous spectrum rather than clustering into two simple, entirely separate categories, meaning the popular, casual division of people into simply morning people and night owls actually represents a considerable oversimplification of what the underlying research reveals, a genuinely broad, continuous range of individual variation, with the more extreme morning and evening types representing the outer edges of a spectrum along which the majority of people actually fall somewhere closer toward the middle, carrying a genuinely intermediate chronotype rather than a strongly pronounced tendency in either particular direction. These same standardized measurement tools have also allowed researchers to study how chronotype distribution varies across different populations and cultures worldwide, finding genuinely interesting patterns connected to factors including latitude and typical local light exposure conditions, with some research suggesting populations living at higher latitudes, experiencing more dramatic seasonal variation in daylight hours, may show somewhat different average chronotype distributions compared to populations living closer to the equator, where day length remains considerably more consistent throughout the year. This cross-cultural research adds a genuinely valuable additional dimension to the purely genetic story discussed throughout tonight's episode, suggesting that while individual chronotype traces back significantly to inherited genetic variation, the broader environmental and cultural context a population has historically inhabited may have also played some meaningful, still actively researched role in shaping which particular chronotype variants prove most advantageous, and therefore most likely to persist and spread, within different human populations across different parts of the world. Researchers studying the genuine, practical consequences of chronotype mismatch, the common situation in which a person's biologically preferred sleep timing conflicts significantly with the schedule their work, school, or broader social obligations actually require them to follow, have identified and carefully studied a phenomenon they call social jetlag, essentially describing the same kind of physiological disruption experienced during actual travel-related jetlag, but produced instead by a chronic, ongoing mismatch between a person's internal circadian timing and their externally imposed daily schedule, rather than by genuine travel across time zones. Researchers measuring social jetlag typically calculate it by comparing a person's actual sleep timing on days when their schedule is externally constrained, ordinary work or school days, against their more naturally preferred sleep timing on days when they're genuinely free to sleep and wake according to their own internal preference, with the resulting difference between these two patterns serving as a genuinely useful, measurable indicator of how significantly a person's daily life currently conflicts with their underlying biological chronotype. Large-scale studies measuring social jet lag across broad populations have found that individuals with a strongly evening-leaning chronotype, forced by conventional work and school schedules into considerably earlier waking than their biology would naturally prefer, experience measurably greater social jet lag on average compared to morning-type individuals, whose naturally preferred schedule tends to align considerably more comfortably with conventional societal timing expectations in the first place. Research studying the broader health consequences of chronic social jet lag has found genuinely concerning associations with numerous negative outcomes, including elevated rates of reported fatigue, mood disturbance, and, in several larger population studies, measurably increased risk for various metabolic and cardiovascular health concerns, offering compelling, evidence-based support for the idea that chronotype mismatch represents a genuine, ongoing source of physiological strain rather than simply an inconvenient, easily dismissed scheduling preference. Some researchers studying social jet lag have drawn a genuinely useful, direct comparison to the more familiar experience of actual travel-related jet lag, noting that while an ordinary international trip typically produces a temporary, self-resolving period of circadian disruption lasting days to at most a couple of weeks before the body fully adjusts to the new time zone, chronic social jet lag instead subjects an evening-type person to the same fundamental category of physiological strain on a genuinely continuous, unending basis, repeating in a smaller but persistent form essentially every single workweek throughout their entire adult life, since weekday demands force earlier waking while weekends allow a partial, temporary return to more natural timing, only for the following Monday to reimpose the same disruptive mismatch all over again. This repeating weekly pattern, sometimes informally described by researchers as a kind of mini jet lag experienced every week rather than only during occasional travel, helps explain why the cumulative health consequences of chronic social jet lag, discussed throughout this section, can prove genuinely significant over time, even though any single week's disruption might seem, in isolation, considerably more modest than a dramatic multi-time zone journey. While chronotype carries a genuinely significant, well-documented genetic foundation, researchers studying the broader circadian rhythm system have found that light exposure timing plays a genuinely important, actively modifiable role in shaping precisely where within a person's genetically determined range their actual, day-to-day sleep timing ultimately settles. Specialized cells within the retina, distinct from the more familiar rod and cone cells responsible for ordinary visual perception, contain a light-sensitive pigment called melanopsin, and connect directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master circadian clock discussed in the earlier Sleep Lab episode covering the body's overnight processes, allowing incoming light information to directly, powerfully influence the timing of the body's core circadian rhythm largely independent of a person's ordinary conscious visual perception. Researchers studying light exposure's specific timing effects have found that bright light exposure earlier in the morning tends to shift a person's internal clock earlier, encouraging correspondingly earlier sleep onset the following evening, while bright light exposure later in the evening tends to shift the internal clock later, delaying subsequent sleep onset. A well-established relationship researchers have mapped in considerable, precise detail using what's called a phase response curve, describing exactly how much and in which direction light exposure shifts circadian timing depending on the specific time of day the light exposure actually occurs. This research carries genuinely practical significance for evening-type individuals hoping to modestly shift their own natural timing somewhat earlier, since deliberately increasing bright light exposure, ideally genuine sunlight, during the early morning hours, combined with deliberately reducing bright light exposure, particularly from screens and other artificial sources, during the evening hours, can produce a genuine, measurable shift towards somewhat earlier sleep timing, though researchers are careful to emphasize this environmental strategy generally shifts a person's timing modestly within their underlying genetic range, rather than genuinely transforming a strongly evening-type individual into a fundamentally different, strongly morning-type chronotype entirely. The same melanopsin-driven light sensing system has become the subject of considerable, genuinely practical research interest regarding modern artificial lighting specifically, since researchers have found that the particular wavelength of light matters considerably for how strongly it influences circadian timing, With the blue-toned light emitted heavily by many electronic screens and certain energy-efficient light bulbs proving considerably more effective at triggering circadian shifting effects than the warmer, more amber-toned light historically produced by traditional incandescent bulbs or, further back, simple firelight and candlelight, the dominant artificial light sources for the vast majority of human evolutionary history. This research has directly informed the growing popularity of blue light filtering screen settings and warmer evening lighting recommendations, offering a genuinely evidence-based rationale grounded directly in the same underlying melanopsin biology discussed throughout this section, rather than representing simply an unsupported, trendy wellness recommendation lacking genuine scientific grounding. Researchers studying cognitive performance across the day have found genuinely compelling evidence that the specific time at which a person performs best on various mental tasks correlates measurably with their individual chronotype, offering direct, evidence-based support for something many people have long suspected about their own personal experience without any formal scientific confirmation. Studies measuring attention, working memory, and processing speed across different times of day have consistently found that morning-type individuals tend to show peak performance considerably earlier in the day compared to evening-type individuals, whose own measured peak performance window tends to occur correspondingly later, sometimes not arriving until early evening, hours after a morning-type colleague's own personal peak has already come and gone. Genuinely interestingly, researchers studying this pattern have also found that the specific type of cognitive task matters considerably for how strongly chronotype-based timing effects actually manifest, with some research finding that certain kinds of creative, less rigidly structured thinking tasks show evening-type individuals performing surprisingly well even during their own theoretically non-optimal morning hours, a pattern some researchers connect to reduced inhibitory cognitive control during a person's non-peak alertness window, potentially allowing more loosely associative, creative thinking patterns to emerge more readily, an intriguing, still actively researched possibility suggesting the relationship between chronotype and cognitive performance may prove considerably more nuanced than a simple, uniform peak and decline pattern applying identically across every different type of mental task. This research carries genuinely significant practical implications for how workplaces, educational institutions, and individuals themselves might thoughtfully consider scheduling their most demanding cognitive work, suggesting that rigidly uniform scheduling expectations, assuming every person's peak mental sharpness naturally aligns with the conventional 9-to-5 workday, likely leaves considerable cognitive potential unrealized for the substantial proportion of any given population whose genuine, biologically rooted chronotype simply doesn't happen to match that particular conventional assumption. Some researchers studying this performance timing relationship have extended their work into examining real-world academic and workplace outcomes directly, finding genuinely suggestive evidence that evening-type students required to attend early morning classes show measurably lower average grades in those specific early courses compared to their own performance in identical courses scheduled later in the day. A within-student comparison that helps rule out the possibility that this difference simply reflects evening types being generally less capable students overall, since the very same individual student's own performance shifts measurably depending on what time of day a particular course happens to be scheduled, offering compelling additional evidence that chronotype schedule mismatch carries genuine, measurable academic consequences extending well beyond simple laboratory-based cognitive testing alone. The accumulated body of research discussed throughout tonight's episode regarding adolescent chronotypes' genuine, biologically driven shift toward later sleep timing has carried genuine, real-world policy influence extending well beyond academic research journals alone. The American Academy of Pediatrics, drawing directly on this accumulated body of sleep and chronotype research, issued a formal policy statement in 2014 specifically recommending that middle and high schools begin no earlier than 8:30 in the morning, explicitly citing the well-documented biological reality of adolescent circadian delay as the primary scientific justification behind the recommendation, rather than framing later start times as simply a matter of convenience or preference. Several school districts across the United States and in other countries have subsequently implemented later start times directly informed by this research, and researchers studying the actual, measured outcomes of these policy changes have found genuinely encouraging results, including studies finding measurably improved student attendance, reduced rates of reported daytime sleepiness, and in some studied districts, measurably improved academic performance following the shift to later school start times, offering compelling, real-world confirmation that respecting genuine, biologically rooted chronotype differences, rather than expecting every student to simply conform to a fixed, uniformly early schedule regardless of their own underlying circadian timing, can produce measurable, meaningful benefit extending well beyond simple comfort or convenience alone. This policy shift represents a genuinely significant, still ongoing example of chronotype research moving beyond purely academic interest into genuine, practical, evidence-based public health application, offering a hopeful model for how similar genuine, biologically informed accommodation might eventually extend into other institutional settings, including workplaces, that have historically operated according to similarly rigid, one-size-fits-all scheduling assumptions that tonight's accumulated research increasingly suggests fail to genuinely serve a meaningful proportion of the actual population being asked to conform to them. Despite this generally encouraging policy trend, researchers and advocates working in this specific area emphasize that implementation has remained genuinely uneven across different districts and regions, with practical obstacles including school bus transportation logistics, after-school sports scheduling, and childcare arrangements for younger siblings frequently cited by school administrators as significant barriers to adopting later start times even where the underlying scientific case remains genuinely strong and well-established. This uneven, still ongoing implementation offers a useful, honest reminder that translating solid, well-replicated scientific findings into genuine, widespread practical policy change often requires navigating a genuinely complex web of competing logistical and social considerations well beyond the science itself, even when, as in this particular case, the underlying research evidence supporting the change has grown increasingly difficult for informed policymakers to reasonably dispute. Beyond the purely biological and genetic dimensions explored throughout tonight's episode, researchers studying broader social attitudes toward chronotype have found genuinely consistent, well-documented evidence of a meaningful cultural bias favoring morning-type individuals and correspondingly stigmatizing evening-type individuals, often through characterizations implying laziness, poor discipline, or diminished conscientiousness, despite the accumulated genetic and physiological evidence discussed tonight indicating these differences trace back to genuine, largely involuntary biological variation rather than any meaningful difference in character or effort. Studies examining common personality trait assumptions connected to chronotype have found that evening types are frequently, informally perceived by others as less reliable or less hardworking compared to morning types, a perception researchers studying actual, objectively measured personality and performance data have found generally fails to hold up under careful, controlled scientific scrutiny, with evening types showing no genuine, consistent deficit in underlying conscientiousness or work ethic. Once researchers properly account for the simple fact that conventional scheduling structures happen to more comfortably accommodate morning-type timing preferences in the first place. Some researchers studying this cultural bias have connected it to a longer historical pattern, noting that cultural proverbs and idioms celebrating early rising, familiar phrases suggesting virtue and success specifically attached to waking early, have circulated across numerous cultures and historical periods for centuries, well before any of tonight's genetic research existed to properly, scientifically evaluate whether such cultural assumptions actually reflected genuine underlying truth. Understanding the genuine biological basis behind chronotype variation, discussed throughout tonight's episode, offers a genuinely useful corrective lens for reconsidering this persistent cultural bias, reframing evening-type tendency not as a character flaw deserving quiet embarrassment, but as one genuine, naturally occurring variety among the broader range of human biological diversity, deserving the same basic respect and reasonable accommodation any other well-documented, heritable physiological difference would ordinarily receive. This cultural bias has also shown up in genuinely measurable ways within professional and educational evaluation settings specifically, with some researchers finding evidence that supervisors and teachers, even when working from identical underlying performance data, tend to rate individuals who arrive notably early as somewhat more conscientious and dependable compared to individuals who arrive later but stay correspondingly later as well, despite both patterns representing, in genuinely equivalent terms, the same total commitment and effort simply distributed across a differently timed schedule. Researchers studying this evaluation bias suggest it likely reflects a kind of availability heuristic, where an early arrival is a directly, easily observed behavior occurring at a time when few colleagues are present to notice, making it feel disproportionately salient and memorable, while an evening type's equally dedicated, equally hard-working late-day effort often goes considerably less visibly observed and credited simply because fewer colleagues remain present in the workplace to actually witness it occurring. We close tonight's exploration with the practical question naturally following from everything discussed throughout tonight's episode: what does genuinely working with, rather than fighting against, your own particular chronotype actually look like in evidence-based practice? Sleep researchers studying chronotype accommodation generally converge on a few consistent, practical recommendations. For genuine evening types facing schedule demands that conflict meaningfully with their natural timing, deliberately structuring the most demanding, high-focus tasks during whatever window genuinely represents their own personal peak alertness, even if that window sits later in the day than conventional scheduling assumptions might otherwise suggest, tends to produce measurably better performance than rigidly attempting to force peak effort during hours a person's own biology simply isn't yet prepared to fully support. Where genuine flexibility exists, whether through remote work arrangements, flexible school or work scheduling, or simply rearranging personal daily routines wherever possible, aligning one's most important activities with one's own measured, genuine chronotype rather than an arbitrary, externally imposed standard represents a consistently evidence-supported strategy for improving both performance and overall well-being. For situations where genuine flexibility remains limited, the light exposure strategies discussed earlier tonight, bright light soon after waking and dimmer, warmer light in the evening hours, offer a genuinely evidence-based, modest tool for gently nudging one's natural timing somewhat earlier without requiring a person to abandon or feel ashamed of their own underlying biological chronotype altogether. Perhaps most importantly, researchers studying this entire body of work consistently emphasize a broader, gentler point worth carrying forward beyond any single specific strategy, that self-compassion regarding one's own natural sleep timing isn't simply a comforting sentiment, but represents a genuinely evidence-based response to what the accumulated science actually, clearly shows, that whether you naturally rise with the earliest light or find your own clearest thinking arriving well after most of the world has already gone quiet, your particular rhythm was never a failure of discipline at all, but simply, quietly, one genuine expression of the same remarkable genetic diversity that has shaped human biology since long before any clock, conventional schedule, or cultural expectation ever existed to measure it against. There is one final, practical thought worth carrying forward from tonight's episode, connecting back directly to the very first fact explored this evening. The clock genes ticking away within nearly every cell of your body tonight have been performing this same essential, rhythmic work since long before humans existed at all, inherited across an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary time, present in some recognizable form within organisms as distant from us as fruit flies and even certain bacteria. Whatever specific timing your own particular genetic variant happens to produce, earlier or later, is simply the latest expression of a genuinely ancient, remarkably successful biological system, one that has never actually needed your permission, your effort, or your approval to keep faithfully doing its work, and isn't about to start requiring it now. Tonight we walk slowly through the genuine, well-documented genetics and biology behind one of the most common, and most commonly misunderstood, sources of everyday human variation, the simple, persistent difference between those who rise easily with the earliest light and those whose own clearest thinking arrives only once the rest of the world has gone quiet. We discovered the actual clock genes ticking within nearly every cell of your body, and traced PR3 and CRY1's specific, measurable influence over whether your own particular rhythm leans early or late. We felt the genuine, physiological reality behind an evening type's delayed melatonin and shifted temperature rhythm, and watched chronotype shift predictably across an entire human lifetime, from childhood's early rising through adolescence's biologically genuine delay and back toward morning type tendency again in later adulthood. We considered a genuinely compelling evolutionary theory for why this diversity exists at all, and met the careful researchers who first made chronotype something science could actually, rigorously measure. We examined social jet lag's genuine physiological cost, and considered how light exposure timing can gently, meaningfully shift your natural rhythm within its underlying genetic range. We discovered peak cognitive performance genuinely tracking chronotype-specific timing, and traced how this research has already, directly reshaped school start time policy in the real world. We named the genuine, largely unfair cultural stigma night owls have long quietly carried, and closed with what the evidence actually, gently suggests, that working with your own particular rhythm, rather than constantly fighting against it, represents not a lesser path, but simply the wiser one. If tonight's journey into your own genuine, inherited rhythm was worth your time, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps the Sleep Lab stay open for the next curious, sleepy mind who finds their way here. And if you're still awake, well, perhaps that's exactly where your own particular rhythm was always going to bring you tonight, and there's another story waiting just beyond this one whenever you're ready for it. But for now, let your own body settle into whatever timing genuinely feels like yours. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Sleep well. And good night.